Here we go. Welcome to Senate Education, Wednesday, February 1st, 1:33 p.m. We're going to start by having a conversation around teaching salaries here in Vermont, just so we understand where things stand, what sorts of things the legislature may or may not want to do. But the overarching issue that we're looking at is a massive teacher shortage in the state of Vermont, across the country. How can we be competitive? What is, being competitive look like? A lot of these, all of these things are made by local school boards, etc. I think it's just important for us to have the conversation and then just ask ourselves as a state, should we set a minimum salary for teachers? I guess it'll be interesting to me personally just to see where people are and what they think, and just kind of help us all understand that. We're then going to continue our conversations around universal meals. We're going to hear from then the deans of University of Vermont and Castleton on teacher education, and then return to Teaching Vermont campaign with Merrigan Cargill, who will give us a sense of, how are we helping our teachers with their debt. But to kick us off, Ms. Julia Richter, fiscal analyst for Joint Fiscal, who does great work for all of us, and we're grateful that you're here and grateful to you for taking the time to put together this presentation. So with that, Ms. Richter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's nice to be in the committee. I think this is my first time testifying in person this year to you all. So I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. I'm a fiscal analyst. I focus on the education fund primarily. So I was asked to come in here to talk about teacher salaries in Vermont. And so my presentation is really sort of two parts. The first is to just think about the mechanics of the education fund. Where do teacher salaries fall in the education fund? And then the second is to get a little bit more into understanding comparisons of teacher salaries, both within Vermont and then within the Northeast and the nation as a whole. Did you want me to share my slide deck, Chair?
I would like you to, if you would.
Sure.
And Scott or Hayden can give you access to the big screen.
Sure. Yeah, Hayden did share the Zoom link with me ahead of time, so I'm just going to log in.
Thank you.
For people watching at home, there is a presentation that you can download that is available under my name on the committee page. It does say, please wait for the host to start the meeting.
Hayden, is that something you can do?
Yeah, let me try and troubleshoot it right now.
Should I just get started, or?
Why don't you get started?
Okay. So I'm starting out. I do see that the committee has the slide deck in front of them. So I am on page 2 now, and just thinking about the mechanics of the education fund. I know that Brad James from AOE came and talked to you all about the education fund and how that works. So Ian's just letting me in right now so I can pull up my slides. Okay. All right. So here we are on slide 2. So yeah, so Brad walked you through the education fund and how that works. And you'll recall that each school district builds an annual budget, right? And that requires local voters' approval. And we can think about that local budget big picture as having sort of 2 primary parts. It's got the offsetting revenue, so that includes things like categorical aid, so specific aid coming from the state of Vermont or the federal government, tuition revenues, other things like that. And then it also has the other part, which is education spending. And education spending is really one of those factors that is used to adjust the local property taxes. Education spending per equalized pupil, you hear a lot about, because that is the state, the local determined factor of how property taxes are adjusted in correspondence with the statewide yield. So unless funded by categorical aid or federal funding, personnel salaries, including teachers, fall into that district's education spending in Vermont. So as I mentioned, that education spending per equalized pupil ultimately drives adjustments to the local homestead property tax rates. So I've got this all else equal here because we've got the education fund and all these things coming and going. When we're looking at changing one thing, it's helpful to think, okay, if nothing else were to change, how would one specific change be reflected within the education fund? So if all else is equal, increases to teacher salaries would be borne by property taxes, right? Because that's that adjustment that's used to make up the difference. And in a single school district, if a single school district increases its teacher salaries, its homestead property tax rate will increase accordingly, all else equal. So that's sort of big picture mechanics of the education fund. I'll pause there if there's any questions about that before moving into comparisons. Okay, so I do want to just raise a couple of considerations when comparing and analyzing teacher salaries. I pulled some data from AOE from FY 20 and 21 and looked at average teacher salaries in Vermont across all positions, all categories like pre-K teacher, special education teacher, elementary school teacher. And I looked at what the average salary was for those different positions. And we see there's a range of about 55,500 for one category of teacher at the lowest end of the range, up to an average in the highest teacher category of 78,300.
Senator Hashim.
Just a quick question. I'm curious how this salary range compares to other people in Vermont. And do you happen to know what the median income is in Vermont in general?
I don't have that number. I can certainly get back to you with
That'd
it.
be great. Thank
Yeah, sure.
Senator Gould.
And category is not based on geography or anything like that, strictly a difference in job.
Correct. So I was aware of the committee's limited time capacity. So for the range of, I could have also looked at geographies. I thought to look at, you know, a pre-K teacher versus a special education teacher or
Yeah,
elementary
thank
school.
you.
Mhm. And so there are, as you mentioned, Senator, a number of reasons why salaries may vary. It could be position, location, bargaining agreement, experience, education level. I'm sure that the stakeholders are much better to speak to that than I am, but it's something to keep in mind, that variance of salaries.
May I just interrupt also? Is there any guidance out there in statute that says teacher that gives school board members and negotiators some kind of guidelines to follow? 5-year teacher should be at least making this. Is there anything in statute now around those kinds of guidelines that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of anything,
Okay.
but I would defer to my
Happy to.
ledge council
Yeah.
counterpart, Beth,
Yeah.
who would be able to speak to that. Yeah. And then the other thing that I also, in terms of considerations that I did want to raise, is salary doesn't necessarily capture all compensation of an employee, right? So teachers also receive non-salary benefits like pensions and healthcare. So AOE also publishes data that in addition to the salaries includes benefits. So I did the same exercise that I did with salaries, and I looked at, okay, what is the average across all teachers, including salary and benefits, and that was about 80,000. And then what is that range? And that ranged from 71,900 through 101,000. So just keeping that in mind, that salary is one metric when examining compensation of a teacher or personnel, but it's not necessarily the only metric for looking at compensation.
And senators, I think it's tomorrow, the next day, we are getting pension 101, just so everybody gets a sense of where things are at.
Okay, great. And so then keeping these in mind, I was asked to come in and talk about salaries. So I pulled from the National Education Association. They publish data that compares the average salary across the United States by state. And so this is before adjusting for cost of living. So we have to keep in mind that, you know, living in Vermont versus living in Louisiana or California, salaries, compensation might not go as far in different places. So this is before adjusting for that cost of living. So when we've got those numbers in front of us, we see that Vermont has the 19th highest average teacher salary nationally and the 3rd lowest in the Northeast. And I do want to include that caveat that this salary comparison doesn't include those benefits that I just spoke about.
Senator Brewer. Are there any, I don't, okay, I think Scott will get some. Okay. Here you guys. If anyone would like a mask, Mr. Moore has them. His director, please.
Okay. So that's just to help us understand Vermont in the context of the nation, but this doesn't adjust for cost of living. So then, as in a trained economist, I think, okay, well, we really should be also looking at the cost of living when comparing salaries, because that's another way to inform. So the cost of basic needs like food, childcare, everything that I know you're all well aware of, they vary by state. And so one way that you can compare salaries is using, you know, the living wage in each state. And MIT publishes a living wage calculator, which uses the same methodology to calculate the living wage in each state. So it provides a helpful benchmark for us to think about how we can compare salaries. So I applied the living wage benchmark against all of the average salaries that we had published that I just presented in the previous slide. Looks as though my slide deck just went out on me. But I'm on slide 6 now. And I'm gonna just reshare my screen. I'm trying to go through. I don't want to take into anyone else's time.
You're fine, we're good.
Okay. You all see my screen?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just talking about adjusting for cost of living. And so then I took the same numbers that we were just looking at, published by NEA, that are the average salaries across the country. And then I said, okay, well, what if we compare for cost of living? And I didn't include any average salaries or wages on this page because that would be kind of like comparing apples to oranges. It would be difficult to interpret. So instead, I just included the ranks. So where does Vermont rank within the nation? And where do other Northeast states rank within the nation? And then also where does Vermont rank within the Northeast? So as we saw those rankings here in slide 4, we saw that 1 means that they had New York had the highest average teacher salary in the country, right? 51 would be the lowest average teacher salary in the country. So when we come to the adjustment of cost of living, we see that Vermont has, after adjusting, the 24th highest average teacher salary nationally, and then the 6th lowest in the Northeast. And once again, this is the same caveat that the salary comparison doesn't include benefits or pensions or any of those other compensation. That wraps up my prepared remarks, but I'm happy.
Senator Weeks.
Just curiosity, so from your research, did you ever touch on the pensions kind of in somewhat equilibrium between states, that they're kind of the same scale?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. I would have to touch base with Chris Roop. He's really the pension expert. Yeah.
If you had touched it.
No.
Any questions? Yes, Senator Williams.
So have you seen any indication that when one school district raises the wages of their teachers, that there's a cascading effect that others do that?
That's an excellent question. I don't feel that I could speak to those school districts' decisions. I would defer to the people on the ground who are seeing how those school districts are making decisions.
Yeah, just sort of, again, thumbnail sketch, if Vermont cost of living was, like, say, pegged at 1,
Mhm.
how does that relate to the New York? Like how, cost of living factor, significantly, can you,
Yeah,
'cause I know
certainly.
you use, in your formula, you must have used a factor. I'm wondering, like,
Sure.
how different?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say, so the living wage, if there is a hot link, if you do go onto the website, you can play with the calculator. But essentially what the living wage is it says, okay, to support, one adult with no children, this is the hourly rate that this hourly wage that a wage earner would need to make. And then 2 adults or with 2 children. And so I pulled from the living wage calculator, all using the same assumptions. And then I divided that by the average salary to figure out how that broke up.
Okay.
And I will say, I don't do this personally, but our office, JFO, publishes a basic needs budget and a living wage report. So thinking about living wage and what it can or cannot capture is certainly something that JFO has thought about and worked on.
So
So the teachers' pension, is that they're considered state employees? Are they all on the same pension schedule?
I don't want to speak with
Okay.
certainty. There are pension costs that are coming out of the education fund.
I think it's fine. But Mr. Robinson from the NEA is behind you. Mr. Robinson, would you just mind responding to that question?
Sure.
First being, are teachers are they state employees? And then,
Yeah, so for the record, Colin Robinson, Vermont NEA, there are 3 pension systems in Vermont. There's the state employees pension system, the municipal employees pension system, and the teachers pension system. There are 3 separate funds. The licensed teachers, including teachers, principals, and superintendents, are in the teacher system. School support staff, unlicensed school employees, are in the municipal pension system. And
so paraeducators,
correct.
okay.
Are in the municipal pension system, and then state employees are in the state system. As Julia mentioned, there are portions of the cost for the state teachers retirement system that come out of the education fund, and she can speak clearly about what that looks like, I'm sure, at a point if needed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Richter, this might be a question for Ledge Council, but do you know if any other states set a minimum salary for teachers?
I don't know. I would need to look into it. I know that there are conversations that are happening at the federal level, but I haven't looked into that in more detail.
And I guess the other question would be, and this might be something might hear from our other witnesses, is there something for the state employees where they are, tagged at a certain level, therefore they come in at this salary and then automatically in 5 years, automatically in 10 years, those kinds of increment?
Like a wage step
Yeah,
structure or
like
something.
that. Yeah.
I would need to get back to you on how that works at the state level.
Would you mind doing that?
Sure.
Yeah, it could even be by email.
Yeah, definitely.
Senator Schooler? So this, it's helpful, as we jump into this and understanding what it's like to be a teacher, it's really helpful for us to understand what salaries look like, what the competition looks like. And like I said, we'll be digging into this with other witnesses. Do you know the lowest teaching salary in Vermont?
I do not.
I think Mr. Robinson may be able to share that with us. So, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Robinson.
Can I get an elbow? Trying to, let me rephrase it in my mind before I ask it. The teachers' healthcare, do they go through the same system as VLCT for the municipalities? They don't. The reason I ask that is because at the local level, part of the municipalities, figuring the wages of their employees, they take their healthcare costs into effect. And even though they're not making a lot of money per hour,
Yeah,
when you factor in the pension or the actual pension contributions and the health benefits, that's significant. So I'm just trying to compare, we have different systems.
yeah, no, you're asking the right question, it's for sure. And I thought that one slide in particular was helpful to kind of look at it from the pension health, issue, as a compensation package, if you
I
will.
mean, if it's a good compensation package, it might make us number one.
Might,
in
yeah,
doing that.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Richter. This was a lot of work. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to. I'll stay in the room in case there's any other.
That would be great.
Questions?
Thank you. The order I have is Francis Nichols, Tinney, Robinson, you're not even up here, but whatever order you guys all want to go. Colin,
Yeah.
Colin, you're up.
School meal, no, you jump to the school meals.
Oh, you're right.
No, I'm not sure.
About time someone. Not
Yeah.
let me get away with
Happy to
some of my shenanigans. Okay, this is from Mr. Robinson.
Yeah.
Don't worry,
Oh,
that
wow,
late, don't
printed.
worry, yeah. I know it was emailed last minute, but we got it printed.
Appreciate it. I didn't need it printed. I appreciate it. Wonderful.
Mr. Robinson,
Great.
thank you.
So for the record, Colin Robinson, Vermont NEA, and really appreciate the conversation, the topic. I want to sort of speak to the crux of the conversation first, but some of the other questions that have come up today, I'd be happy to speak to as well.
And I should make it clear, this is my pet question.
Yeah.
This has been on my
Yep.
mind, teacher salaries, workforce development kinds of things. So I just want to make sure that everybody,
Absolutely.
one of the powers of being a chairman.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
only-
Absolutely. No, it's good. It's
Yeah,
important
right,
conversation.
yeah, right.
So I want to start with a little bit of context, and the report, feel free to peruse it at your leisure, but by painting out the education workforce, and I'm going to talk about both teachers as well as school support staff, because I think for many of the reasons that you've heard, we need to be having a conversation about both segments of our education workforce. I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody. It's a female-dominated workforce. 75% of teachers are female. Over 80% of school support staff are female. It's a highly educated workforce. According to the 2018 report that you have in front of you, about 3/4 of teachers either have master's degrees or are pursuing master's degrees.
In Vermont.
In Vermont, yep, this is Vermont. And actually nearly 50% of paraeducators in Vermont have bachelor's degrees. So, this is a highly educated workforce. As you just heard, well, actually, they are compared to other peers with similar education levels. In Vermont, teachers are paid 86 cents on the dollar. So compared to other professionals with master's degrees, again, 86 cents on the dollar. You heard from Julie's testimony, some information. The link is also referenced in my testimony to this national salary database that she utilized. But I think the key points there are that Vermont is really at kind of in the middle of the pack when it comes to whether you're talking about average salary, but also starting salary. We ranked 26th in the country with a average starting salary of about just over 40,000. With the lowest starting salary in the 2021-2022 school year being one SU or SD that had a starting teacher salary of $36,975. So that would be somebody coming in right out of school with no experience. If you aren't familiar with educator salary schedules, specifically on the teacher side, there's a whole schedule that overlays with years of experience and levels of education that folks move along as they advance in their career to reflect their years of service as well as their educational attainment.
And is that like a statewide policy that everyone has to follow?
No. So, which brings me to kind of a final point. We have local collective bargaining in Vermont, right? We have local control, but at its base, collective bargaining is an arrangement between, and a conversation, a negotiation ultimately between one's employer and employees, right? And in Vermont's education system, we have, as we know, multiple school districts or supervisory districts and unions, and those are who the local teachers and school support staff negotiate with. So to that end, we have 72 local associations across the state, and each of those local associations, many of them are comprised of a support staff unit, because there is a separate bargaining unit from teachers, and they locally negotiate with their school boards over the terms and conditions of employment, including salaries and the salary schedules. I mentioned school support staff. We're 29th in the country in terms of our support staff wage annualized. I didn't do all the really great sort of additional calculations that Julia did for inflationary or cost of living adjustments and the stuff and the like. Also, just by way of reference on the education workforce, just generally, I think we know that the challenges the education workforce is facing predated the pandemic.
Yeah.
And also, as a point of information, there's been a 50% decline in people pursuing degrees in education since 50% over the past 15 years. So there are 50% fewer people entering programs in colleges and universities to become teachers.
Senator Hashim.
So I have a question that I think is related to what you just
Yeah.
described. I'm curious as to how much you think it's related to pay versus how much it's related to the work environment and the challenges with going into teaching, because as it relates to the declining number of folks who are going into this. And I mean, I lived with a teacher for a number of years, and just watching the amount of work that she did after hours and on the weekend and during the summer, I'm just like, it's incredible. So what are your thoughts on pay versus work environment?
I think it's a totality of all of it. I don't think it's any one. And I think what essentially you're describing are kind of the working conditions. What we hear from our members is yes, right? It's compensation as well as all the things that you've heard collectively, as well as what you're describing, Senator. And so I think that creates a confluence of events that for folks who might be thinking about pursuing a career in education are like, okay, maybe I'm not, or maybe I'll pursue something that is perhaps a little different. I don't think it's any one. And to that end, I don't think that there is any single solution to how we build up our education workforce going forward. I think compensation should be a component. Vermont NEA believes compensation should be a component of that. But by no means is it the totality of the solution.
Just out of curiosity, just to really understand the numbers,
Yeah.
is the shift towards paraeducators a strategic decision on the part of school districts and such, or is it a reaction to the lack of teachers coming to the pipeline?
I think it would be great to hear from my colleagues from the Principal and Superintendents Association, since they're the ones who make personnel decisions. I do think as a general matter, school support staff and specifically paraeducators have provided a central role in our education system for a very, very long time. And I don't know that there's been a distinct shift one way or another.
Okay, that's fair.
I do think that their student needs have become more complex. And one of the ways to ensure that students are able to access their learning is by making sure that there are folks like paraeducators, behavioral interventionists in the school environment to assist and support those students being able to access their learning, so the teachers can provide the instruction that the students need and are there to get. They might be able to provide some additional context for your question.
Okay.
So to that end, where do we go? I am really appreciative of this conversation, and I think that to Senator Campion's question earlier, there are some states that have gone the direction of kind of statutory minimum salaries. So in statute, it says, the state statute says, no teacher shall make less than X. I will say there is I would say a tension and potentially a conflict in Vermont with that because we have local control and we have local collective bargaining. And so what you see in my testimony is there are some states that have gone this direction. You'll see states like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they have strong collective bargaining laws. Their statutory minimums are $18,000. I guarantee you there are no teachers in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New Jersey who are making that, assuming they're not some part of a full-time, maybe if they're 0.25% or 0.1% of an FTE. Some other states have more robust salary numbers in statute because they're not collective bargaining states, right? So they have a different way of compensating teachers through non-contractual arrangements that are set in statute. Now, recognizing we can, and historically in Vermont, have set goals for our local districts to work towards, most recently in the context of merging governance structures in Act 46. The legislature, in passing Act 46, set out some specific metrics for districts to follow to attain governance consolidation and other educational quality points, and to incentivize local decision makers, local school boards and communities to make those decisions. They provided some tax benefits. So in conversations this fall with Representative Catherine Sims from the Northeast Kingdom, recognizing that how do we sort of rectify this sort of tension perhaps with a desire of a stated goal, while recognizing local communities and local boards and local unions need to have the ability to make decisions and come to agreement locally. Could we honor that local control and local collective bargaining by setting out some statutory goals for bargaining, a minimum salary of $50,000 for teachers, a minimum wage of school support staff of $20,000, that would then create, if certain districts, and as constructed in the conversations with Representative Sims, it would be specifically tailored towards districts that have high poverty rates and rurality or sparsity that align with the new weights that are being implemented in fiscal years beginning in fiscal years 25. So this concept that we're still working on, I really want to thank Julia for helping Representative Sims think that through, is that for fiscal years 25, 26, and 27, if the two parties, the district and the educators at a local level, through the normal collective bargaining processes, attain these minimum salary benchmarks in those targeted districts, poverty, rurality, then they would be able to take a portion of the cost attributed to that salary increase and remove it from their local education spending calculation for taxing purposes. You remember at the beginning of Julia's presentation, she talked about kind of how things are sort of calculated, education spending. So by creating a local exemption from education spending for a portion of that salary increase, it can create an additional incentive for the two parties potentially to achieve these minimum goals. So that's sort of a construct that we're working on right now, and it's still in the formative stages, although I think we're getting closer to, I think hopefully having something of substance that folks can sink their teeth into.
Senator Williams.
Does the Vermont NEA have a strategic plan that covers anything you just said? You gotta put through some dates out there. So
We have a legislative agenda that incorporates a desire to move towards these sort of minimum thresholds through a construct like I articulated.
is it on your webpage?
Yeah, and I believe it was shared with the committee when our executive director, Jeff Fannin, testified back in January.
Yeah, we can get you another,
Yeah,
those early
happy to.
days,
Yep.
it was like.
Yeah,
it
of
was
course.
Flying at
Yeah.
us, so I'm still getting.
There's a ton of information there. I wouldn't
Yeah.
expect you to
Yeah.
read through the 10 pages of things that. we
So
shared already.
the other associations, do they have input into that plan or?
Well, I would say our legislative agenda is ours, just like their associations have theirs. But obviously, public policy conversations about things like we're here today are everybody's going to engage. And I'm sure in so much as they desire to and would fully support and expect them to.
Senator Pruitt.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you. I'm wondering, this potential legislation that might be coming our way, is there any kind of a precedent for that? It sounds really innovative in some ways.
I think the
At
precedent
46 in a way.
at 46. So I'm gonna go under the hood here real quick of this. And the original construct that Representative Sims and I talked about was a direct reflection of Act 46, which was, for folks who might not know, was a penny rate reduction over a phased-in period that went from, I think at its peak, either 8 or 10 cents down to 2 cents, that gradually waned. In further conversations with JFO, it became clear that, especially with implementing new weights, that particular construct could create some challenges in calculations. And so it moved to this conversation about exempting a percentage of the increase from the local education spending, which then, because of how our education tax are calculated, would have a positive or incentivizing effect on the local tax rates.
Maybe a premature question, but I'm curious, has there been any analysis done that if you set a minimum wage or minimum salary, teacher salary at 50,000, if a second order effect of the other teachers requesting bumps, salary bumps, and what that does to the overall cost of teaching?
So good question. And as a general matter, as I sort of described, you have these local collective bargaining agreements. You have on the teacher side, as well as on the non-licensed educator side, you have a salary schedule, and usually the base does impact other parts of the salary schedule. So your question is the correct and intuitive one. The specific impacts that it would have would be part of local collective bargaining for the two parties to figure out what that would have.
But might there be a financial model that, based on experience, that if you drive minimum, federal minimum wage, maybe you drive up minimum wage, and then that affects, that ripple effects goes across the spectrum of employees?
Is Richter?
Yeah, Julie Richter, JFO. I think that what you're talking about is wage compression, and it's certainly something that has been looked into by people studying minimum wage for a number of different sectors, federally, state level. With respect to a specific model, I would need to do a bit more research. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not an ask. It's just if this becomes live, it's not just the immediate effect, it's the second and third order.
Yeah.
Impacts.
And for what it's worth, I think if we were to ever move in this direction, we definitely would have to really dig in and look at what the implications would be. And I think it's a good point. I mean, we talk about this all the time with minimum wage. If you raise somebody's salary to 15 an hour and they've been making 10, what about the guy or gal that's making 15? What does that look like going forward? And what would those costs be?
Yeah, and I think those are all absolutely fair questions, worth exploration. I think some of the information that was provided by Joint Fiscal really points to kind of where we are in the context of the Northeast, where we are in the context of the nation in terms of these salaries. And so understanding there perhaps is a tension between those two. And if we're talking about attracting, retaining high quality educators, in particular, in this context, we're talking about trying to do it in some of our most rural and highest poverty communities. Because this, as currently constructed, wouldn't necessarily be, it shouldn't be accessible to some of the places where you think of educator compensation already being some of the highest in the state, right? This is an attempt to kind of level up. The one little final note, and then
Let me just have
Yes.
Mr. Weeks jump in. Senator Weeks.
Yeah, so just since you offered it in your data
Yeah.
sheet or your summary, Maine stands out. It's kind of an anomaly. It's got a very high minimum.
Yep.
Okay, but ranks quite low in its national average. It seems counterintuitive. I'm wondering what the experience is there, that they drove it so high, but there's still, it's not it didn't have the resulting effect.
Yeah, so, great question. It just went to
Oh, it
40.
just went, okay.
It just went to
Oh,
40.
okay.
Yeah, this just happened, I
Yeah.
believe. Don't quote me on whether it was 6 months ago or 18 months ago. I don't know exactly, but it was in a very recent period of time when we're talking about being able to see these long-term impacts on data.
Ms. Richter, do you have something, not that you've done it, but is there something out there that you could provide Senator Weeks and the rest of the committee with just around salary increases, minimum wage, what that would look like, you know, in a different, what it's looked like in a different state, something that you've already done for the legislature, or is there something out there that just could help us start to get our heads around it?
I will definitely talk to my colleagues at JFO.
Okay.
I don't work as much on minimum wage.
Just
And
be,
so
yeah,
I'll touch base with a couple of our other analysts and see what we've got
okay, thank
floating
you.
around and can touch base with you
Thank
about
you.
that, definitely.
My only final point, and then I would gladly yield my time from here on out. Some of you might be familiar with former Representative Maida Townsend. She didn't run for re-election this year, but longtime legislator. And she actually was Vermont president back in the 1980s. And during the 80s, she, to your point about sort of a strategic plan, in the 1980s, there was a campaign that she helped lead our members through as the president of our board called the Up from 51st campaign. Because in the 1980s, Vermont's teachers were 51st in the nation. So, we've obviously made a lot of progress since that time. But at the same time, we're still sort of in the middle of the pack as we saw, but it's kind of an interesting little historical note.
Good progress.
Yeah.
It's historic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all very much for taking the time. And
Yeah. Mr. Nichols.
Good afternoon, Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association, for the record. Couple quick things related to what Colin said, and then I'll share any other testimony I have. So any weakening of our pension system, I think would really hurt us in terms of retaining teachers. Senator Weeks asked a question, I believe, about the pension system. A few years ago, maybe it was last year, we had to talk about a plan that the treasurer had that was supported by the House and didn't end up going anywhere in the end. And that pension plan, we actually had it shared with folks, government relations folks at the National Association of Elementary and Secondary School Principals. And they said we would have the 5th worst pension in the United States had we implemented that. Now, we didn't implement it. We made some changes to it. I'm not sure exactly where we stack up now, but it's certainly better than 5th. So it's something to consider, because all the states around us have a better pension system or as good as ours, and they all were gonna have a lot better than ours had we gone to the draconian plan that was put forward, with no raises for cost of living or anything like that for people that retired from now going forward. So that did get shuttered down. So that's
That was the House proposal.
That was House proposal last year. It came from the treasurer, I think, originally.
That's right.
Yeah, and Colin can talk more about that probably, but I just want to mention that. The second thing related to Colin's testimony, he mentioned number of people coming into the field. I gave you some stats on teachers before coming in. If I remember right, there was around 176,000 people were coming into the teaching field, into the colleges of education across the country each year. And now it's somewhere down around 86,000. Those are off the top of my head, but I gave you the actual numbers and testimony a week or so ago. I just wanted to share that. So for us on the minimum teacher pay, first of all, I put a link in here to federal legislation that someone is putting forward that would give teachers a base teacher salary of $60,000. I know if you're familiar with this or not, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but it's federal legislation. We would prefer to see something come from the feds with some federal support to pay for something like that were it to come to fruition. But I put that link in there so you could read that article in Education Week. And I did mention I've discussed with this committee before my increasing concerns about the pipeline nationally and more specifically in Vermont. And an increase in base teacher pay certainly would be helpful in attracting people to the profession and retaining some of our newer educators who I think are woefully underpaid. And that's true for paras too. I'm so supportive of paras that I married a paraeducator. That's how supportive I am.
That's pretty supportive.
That's pretty supportive. However, the how we as a state would go about this without federal financial support concerns me even more than the what at this point. So some of the questions I think that the General Assembly needs to consider. Where will the funds come from? If they're just added on to local budgets, it's going to increase the likelihood that budgets will be voted down. And this will especially impact the least resource communities, which always worries me. Will local school districts be pressured to reduce services to students in other areas if they have to contend with increased teacher salaries? And is there some type of new revenue source that will be considered? And some thoughts, this won't be the most popular one, but maybe it's time to consider a statewide teachers contract negotiating process on salary, as we already do in healthcare. Maybe build in regional indexes that correspond with the cost of living in a given area. I know this flies in the face of local control, but with a statewide education funding system, which is what we have right now, maybe it's time we take a serious look at this. I also just did 5 minutes on Google, and I went to Hawaii and I found out the statewide teachers contract. It's 108 pages long for the whole state, for every teacher in the state. Burlington's is 80 pages long for one school district. Thought that was a little bit illustrative.
We don't have anybody here from Burlington. So.
Yeah, so I thought I would share that. So I think Burlington's is probably the longest, so that's why I picked on them. Maybe there's longer ones, but that's a pretty long one. And I think that any program that is designed should have a gradual implementation, so it's not to shock the system any more than necessary. And just want to finish by saying, I think any questions you have, we agree that starting teachers are underpaid in most parts of the state. And Colin did a good job mentioning support staff too. I didn't put that in my testimony, but he's absolutely right. That's an issue too. And whenever the economy is doing not so well, and people are, doing well, there's people that are out there that have other jobs that pay more money, and we lose many paraprofessionals that say, I can get for example, where I live, right next to where I live, there's a new store, a Tractor Supply store, and they pay more than any of the school districts do for support staff wages. So there's a number of paraeducators in those areas that are saying, well, I'm gonna go work for Tractor Supply. I make more money. I got a full-time year job, and I get health insurance. Whereas in a school district, sometimes school districts do not offer full family health insurance for paraprofessionals. Many times they only offer like a one-person plan. In some cases, they don't offer insurance at all. I also wanted to say that the average teacher pay in Vermont is better than the average pay of teachers in most other states nationally, but it's under the states that would compete with Connecticut, Maine, New Jersey, Massachusetts. And excuse me, did I say Maine? I said Maine twice. It's under Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and New York. It shouldn't be Maine. And slightly better than Maine and New Hampshire are about the same.
Do we have any idea? Not that I expected you to do this, but I do think our kids compete globally.
I do
it
too.
is interesting, and I know you do too.
Yeah.
So
When we
what's
did this,
happening,
we did
in
studies of
China,
NAEP
Europe,
and
yeah.
SBAC when everybody was doing that. Rebecca did a Secretary of Education or Deputy, whatever she was called, Commissioner Holcomb did a study and basically came out with a finding that if Vermont had been a country during that time, we would have came out like 10th or 11th in the whole world if we were a country. So,
What regard in terms of outcomes?
in terms of outcomes based on standardized test scores at the time. And that was based on 4th and 8th grade. I think it was SBAC and NAEP scores, but don't quote me on that. But that was, and there was an article in the paper about how that if we were a country, that's where we would have finished Vermont. So something to think about. Now our test scores have declined some in the last 2 years, at least as far as NAEP. And we're moving away from SBAC, so it's gonna be hard to know how to compare apples to apples. And it's only one piece of data, but it's something to be mindful that Vermont always finishes. Now Massachusetts,
Are there 9
finishes ahead of
countries
us.
then, or yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like Massachusetts, Vermont, I think the other one was either Pennsylvania or New Jersey. Those three, if they had been countries, would have been in the top 10 at that time. And that wasn't that many years ago.
Senator Hushain.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions. I'm curious about the geographic dynamics. It's we're seeing that compared to the rest of the country, we're doing pretty good, but compared to our region, not doing too great. And when it comes to teachers, looking for jobs and moving around, do you find that they are tending to stay in the New England region? Like somebody from Connecticut, if they're shopping around for a new job, are they looking in that area, or do you find that they're coming from all over the country or moving around a lot? What are your...
So I think it's a little bit of all three. I think we have our society now is more of a, in terms of jobs, it's much more mobile than it used to be. And that's true in every field. So you'll see people that'll be like, oh, I think I'll try teaching in Montana. Or I think I'll try being a nurse in Montana, or a healthcare worker in Montana because I want to try out that place. But when we look at a region where somebody's choosing in New England, and they have a choice between a job in New York and a choice between a job in Vermont, it's pretty hard for a new teacher to take the job in Vermont. when New York pays so much more and the retirement's, literally a third, at least better. I have a friend who taught at Fairhaven, who was when he's a little kid, he went to my baseball camp when I was a coach. And he's now an administrator in Fairhaven, in Graniteville, New York. He went across the bridge and he got like a $30,000 raise in a couple of years, and his retirement's almost double. And so and I don't know if we can compete with that, but whatever we can do to help keep people and retain people. Don Tinney made a good point the other day that I always talk about attracting people, but the retention part is equally as important.
Absolutely.
New York doesn't tax its social security. So
There are several states that don't tax Social Security. I can't be quoted on which ones. I think New York doesn't. I also think either Connecticut or Mass, one of those two doesn't.
I know New York does.
Yeah, so that makes a big
It
difference
does
too.
make a big difference. Sure it does.
Yeah.
Sure it does.
Yeah, and in my second question, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the contract negotiating, because I hadn't thought of that or heard of that before. And I'm also curious what Colin might think.
Colin's against it.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not even looking at him right now. One of the reasons why I think it's something we should consider is because it's a statewide education system and all kids should be given the same high level of teachers. And what happens right now is the poorer districts train teachers and they leave to the higher paying districts, often, not all the time. But when I was superintendent of Essex, we wouldn't even look at a teacher that didn't have 5 years experience. When I was superintendent of Franklin Northeast, we would grab teachers as they walked out of the college dorm with their diploma in their hand and try to throw them in the back of the car and kidnap them, make them come teach for us because there were so few candidates. And so there's an advantage to places that are more resourced. So I think that it is time to look at that. A teacher that's working in a place like Bakersfield or North Country or Alberg, if anything, the job sometimes is harder in those places than it is in a place that's better resourced. Yet we pay the teachers that are in better resourced communities a lot more than we do teachers in less resourced communities. And that doesn't really make sense to me. So I think it's time that we start looking at those things. I think that, it's hard in a local control state to do that. And there's also the fear from the teachers union, rightfully so, that maybe then if the state's involved, the state will try to lowball teachers. And so that's a legitimate concern. We don't think teachers should be paid less. We just think it should be more equalized. A teacher that's in South Burlington that's making, let's say they're making $80,000, might be making $50,000 up where I live, and they might actually be working with more students with challenging behaviors and certainly more students that are coming from poverty backgrounds. And so there's an equity issue there too. It's one that we've never addressed as a state.
He's coming in Friday later this week to discuss that. Senator Weeks.
So I spent a lot of time in this new position to try to differentiate between the problem and the symptom.
Yeah.
The symptom this is one of many symptoms that our state struggles to pay our teachers maybe equitably in comparison to the surrounding states. To me, it's a symptom. The problem is that we don't have an economic engine like Connecticut and Massachusetts and New York and Rhode Island. It's difficult. It's not difficult to compare because it's apples and oranges. So I just kind of re-emphasize that I think we need to be taking a look at the problem and recognize the solution and recognize the symptoms, recognize solutions to those symptoms. But the real fundamental problem is the economy. And
I think there's some truth to that. I also think that another factor there is, and this is, we've chosen to have really small schools in Vermont. And because of that, we have really small class sizes, and smaller schools and smaller class sizes cost more money. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. And we did it out of necessity as a state when we first started public education in Vermont, because, we didn't have cars or anything like that. And as a result of that, we have a lot of small schools. Act 46 has helped with that some, but we've got declining enrollment. And when you have really small schools, it does cost more. And it's not like when you lose 20 students in a school over a period of 4 or 5 years, you can just say, okay, we'll have one less teacher. Because those kids don't all come out of the third grade. They're spread out over the ecosystem. So that's a factor there too.
well, it might have been your testimony, which kind of struck me one day, is I think you mentioned historically Vermont came from roughly 2,000 schools.
About 3,000.
3,000.
Yeah.
Okay. And we're down to about 480 schools.
Something like that, depending on how you count.
What's the trend now? Is the trend have we kind of hit what you might consider a low point in that consolidation, or? Are we
I don't know
swinging
about
back to-
I don't know about the college consolidation, but in terms of the numbers, the census is predicting that we're going to be somewhere down to 60,000. Right now, we get just over 80,000. So we still got another 10, 12 years of losing students.
Okay, so you're talking student
I'm
numbers.
talking student numbers, yes.
That's fair.
Yeah. Well,
The economic engine thing, it's real, and
It is.
helps us sometimes sort of rethink then, all right, well, how do we attract teachers to this area? I mean, you know, what are the highlights?
and that's that teach for campaign thing that we keep talking about.
Yeah, well,
Quality
that's-
of life,
right.
how great this place is.
Yeah,
Those types
yeah.
of things.
Yeah, which gets people here,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it does.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, please.
So do you know the demographic on the age of teachers? You know, I remember 15 years ago, it was predicted that we're in an aging population and that we didn't have enough healthcare workers, we didn't have enough nursing homes, and now we're here.
We don't have.
So,
Right.
and I know there are a lot of people that are working in their 70s. So I guess we gotta look at the whole problem too. Is it gonna get better? Because the population demographic, the age is gonna change, or are we gonna lose another 10% of our teachers in 5 years?
I think we're gonna lose another 10% of our teachers in 5 years.
So is there data anywhere about this age demographic inside the teacher population? For example,
Colin might know the answer to that. I don't
He actually
know.
raised his hand.
Who are you saying?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I raised my hand.
Oh,
Please, Mr. Robinson.
I can't speak to the specifics. However, the teachers' pension system, the Vermont State Teachers Retirement System, in their annual valuation does a comprehensive sort of snapshot of who's in the pension, and they're all licensed teachers in our public schools. And so there's a robust data set that talks about a bunch of demographic factors for participants in the pension system. It's not a perfect answer to your question, but I will try and find that slide in
That'd
the
be great.
valuation and send it along.
That'd be helpful, yeah.
because I think in my mind, the visualization of our population age demographic problem is this big bathtub between 20, 25, and then drops off and then rises back again at about 45 or so. And I'm wondering if the teacher population, to my colleague's point, is similar, that it's an older teaching.
Right.
Okay.
right.
So you
And just to weigh in on it too, and Colin mentioned the retirement system, and he can correct me if my numbers are wrong, but when I started in education, it's my understanding that we had something like 6 or 7 or 8 teachers for every retired teacher, and now it's almost a 1-to-1 relationship. So that's scary too.
We definitely feels like we need some blueprint going forward, you know, bringing up what, Senator Williams said, looking at these numbers realistically, what is retirement gonna look like? How can we prepare if all of a sudden things are gonna boom, drop off again?
Agreed.
Mr. Robinson.
I was just gonna provide, I found one of the slides.
Okay.
So the average age of, according to the pension system, the average age of a teacher in the system is 45.2. And those are active members, we're not talking about retirees. And that is a slight decrease from 45.3 in 2021. And they have a nice chart looking at the ages by 5-year increments, and it has a nice kind of bell shape to it with the biggest kind of the 40 to 44, 45 to 49, and 50 to 54 being kind of the peaks of the bell.
Would you mind forwarding that
Yes.
to Hayden and he can share with me? Thank you.
Very well.
Oh,
Sure.
Francis, do you think you can do this in 5 minutes? Is that possible?
To the extent that I've ever been able to do anything in 5 minutes, I'll try. I'm the first witness on meals, so maybe.
We're gonna
I
take a
can-
break. We're gonna hear from you on this. And then we're gonna take a break. We're gonna come back and do about 15 minutes on meals, and then we've got to move on to some folks from UVM.
Sure, that's fine. Jeff Francis from the Superintendent's Association. I'm not sure whether you'll benefit from the fact that I don't have a written testimony or not. I ran out of time this morning because we had some unexpected events we had to contend with. Let me start by saying that everything that's taken place in the conversation so far resonates with me. Because this is a relatively new topic, and I didn't have a lot of context for the opinion from superintendents on this topic, I did what I often do, which is I went to 15 leaders in our association, our 10-member board of trustees and 5 regional group presidents. So that's about 30% of our total membership. And I asked them what they thought, and I presented them with a simple question, which was a uniform standard salary for the entry-level teacher. All 15 replied. I had 7 don't knows, and this is in the question, should we do this?
Yeah,
7 don't knows, 2 no's, and 6 yeses.
interesting.
So that tells me that this is a worthwhile discussion that requires a lot more discussion. I then asked them to discuss really with themselves the advantages and disadvantages. And the responses were instructive, and they're consistent with what you've heard so far. There's a perception that there's a lot of inequity in our delivery system attributable to salaries. And when Colin talks about communities that could be construed to be disadvantaged either because of rurality or poverty, I think that that's a good point. And if we were to map the starting teacher salaries in the state, and that could relatively easily be done, you'd find that the lesser salaries are in the more rural areas or in communities that, from my experience, I know have traditionally had a hard time passing school district budgets. So the pressure on those budgets manifests itself in less access to resources, and that shows up really in all aspects of what the school district is. So that's a generalization, but I think it would hold true if you examined it through data mapping and so on and so forth. I also wanted to comment, because I'm short on time. I mean, I find the notion that you would use an Act 46 type incentive interesting, because if you take a look at the goals of Act 46, and I got them on my phone, I didn't bring them with me, but the conversation prompted me to look at them. The first goal is to provide substantial equity in the quality and variety of educational opportunities statewide. That's a big aspiration for the state. But I do think that when you think about the quality of the education delivery system, you can draw some conclusions around the experience of the teachers and the capacity of the teachers, which in some ways I think ties to salaries, right? One of the things we hear, and this was an argument that the School Board Association and Superintendent Association brought when you were talking about the bill last year for portability for teachers who had signed contracts.
Yeah.
And what we heard from places in the more rural communities was that they feared that legislation because they thought that the outmigration of teachers that were in transportation proximity to centers of population would exacerbate the problem they had with retaining a high quality workforce, right? So if you take a look at Franklin County to Chittenden County, for example, what we hear about is teachers will go to the northern tier, Missisquoi Valley and Franklin Northeast. They'll gain experience, and then they'll move to the Chittenden County area for dramatic salary increases. That's what we're talking about. So, so the other goal of Act 46 that I wanted to mention, and I'd be happy to come back and talk to you about this if you find that it's a worthwhile conversation, was goal number 3, which says maximize operational efficiencies through increased flexibility to manage, share, and transfer resources with a goal of increasing the district level ratio of students to full-time equivalent. My colleague Jay Nichols talked about our desire in the state to operate a lot of small schools. And there's a lot of overhead associated with operating any school. So we're looking at it with school facilities right now. One of the challenges we have with school facilities are how do you maintain too many buildings? So to the extent that you go down this road of discussing this and you wanted to use some sort of a Act 46 type philosophy or operational practice in order to generate the money to increase base salaries, I think you could look at the systems that we have in the state and apply some kind of an efficiency test. Like, did they do what was intended with Act 46 in terms of how they manage their organizations? Because places that have a larger complement of staff, even if they're serving multiple buildings, have flexibility in terms of how they deploy that staff. The other thing that would be interesting to look at, and I just by way of analysis, is what happens with our staff with respect to declines in enrollment. Now, if you ask me the question, what's the current status? I would say that the pressures on public education right now are so great that we're contending with a worker shortage because we don't see a need to diminish staff. But if things were to normalize and you were able to pay people more to teach, then you might be able to rely more on teachers and less on paraeducators, which was a premise of Act 173 in terms of what the overall quality of the system should be. So that, I mean, the reason that I say that this is a worthwhile discussion that needs more discussion is because just around this issue alone, those are the kinds of things that you could think about and look into. In terms of sort of the simplicity, what I heard from superintendents were they would favor an examination of our salaries for the most obvious reason, which is you want to be able to recruit. You don't want a district advantaged or disadvantaged on the basis of starting salary when you're trying to hire the best teachers. And this was a point that Senator Weeks made, I think, the expectation should be that if you up the minimum, that everything else is going to flow out of that. So, you know, I think the thought that I would leave you in summary is this is connected to everything else you're doing. I will connect it to meals when I switch my hats. And it is tied to what's the organizational structure of the delivery system, what methods we use to deploy our staff, how we collectively bargain. And, you know, if you, for lack of a better way to say it, now that healthcare is out of local bargaining, if you take salaries out of local bargaining, what are you then dealing with, right? So one of the comments that I had from superintendents were, this may seem simple, but keep in mind that like some of the higher paid teachers in the state may only be working a 7-hour workday, and some of the lesser paid are on an 8-hour workday. So, you know, even the length of the day comes into the conversation. I will stop here except to say, if you want to pursue this further, and I think it is worthwhile because we want to be competitive in the region and competitive within the systems in Vermont, there's a lot to tease out, and the witnesses you've already heard from and me and people we can each bring to the table can inform the conversation, but there's nothing simple about it.
Committee, I'm going to have to stop there just to get us back on track. I apologize. We are going to take a 5-minute break right now, then we're going to come back in the room and pick up.
I'll be right here waiting.
Well, can I,
Yeah, is it?
relevant to what we're talking about right now, not necessarily school meals. Can I just make a quick comment?
Yeah.
Okay, because I've been holding my thoughts for a while. Number one, education is expensive. We know that, but we also know that educating kids saves money down the line, right? Downstream. We know that. Number one. Number two, we like our small schools. When we even whisper the word consolidation in Burlington, it's like, no, we love our small schools in Vermont. Number three, it's really hard to have this discussion without mentioning the elephant in the room, which is that when you're going to talk about declining enrollment, you've got to address the fact that we have students going to private schools and we have public money going to private schools. Those are two things that if we're going to have this discussion, we need to address as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so about